Let us begin. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Geological Society of London and to this, the 6th Shell Lecture for 2013, entitled Dwarf Elephants, Discovery, Dating and Evolution. My name is David Shilston. I'm President of the Geological Society, and it's my great pleasure to thank Shell UK for making this series of public lectures possible. The extinct dwarf elephants of the Mediterranean evolved many times on many islands from large mainland species. Some of these dwarf species were just 1 meter tall, making them the smallest elephants ever to have lived. But we still don't fully understand why they evolved. We also do not know how old these fossils are. Some of the best were collected over 100 years ago, before modern geological dating techniques were available. Now, our speaker today, Dr. Victoria Herridge of the Natural History Museum, has been seeking out sites excavated by Victorian and Edwardian naturalists, such as Spratt, Leith Adams, Falconer and Dorothea Bate, and bringing modern methods to bear on their discoveries. In this talk, she will spell out what these new findings might mean for our understanding of dwarf elephant evolution. Dr. Herridge investigated the evolution of dwarf elephants for her PhD at the University of London, which led directly to her NERC-funded postdoctoral research at the Natural History Museum. At the museum, she has co-led an international team of specialists on fieldwork in the Mediterranean. Tough job, someone has to do it. At the museum, she delivered the 2012 Charles Lyell Award lecture at last year's BA Festival and co-wrote and appeared in the Natural History Museum's award-winning film, Who Do You Think You Really Are? Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Victoria Herridge.
Thank you. We're going to look at some dates, hopefully, but I actually want to start with a much more recent date. I want you to come back with me to July the 22nd, 1904, because on that day, Dorothea Bate woke up very early. She was in Chania in Crete, and she'd been in Crete for the last 4.5 months. She was going to leave in 3 days' time. She had a boat out on the 25th. The last 4.5 months she'd spent scouring the island looking for fossils, and she'd found them. She'd found fossils of deer and of hippo, but she hadn't found the one thing that she'd gone there to find, that she really, really wanted to find. And today was her last day in the field. She had a lead, a guide, a shepherd had told her something, and she was determined to follow it to see what she could find. So she got on her pony with her guide, and they rode 10 miles to a place called the Cave of the Bear, and they left their ponies, and they walked down what would have been then a rough track. It's a tourist path now. And they walked down this rough track, past the ruins of a Byzantine monastery that straddles a gorge, and then they clambered down a goat path to a dry riverbed, a gorge. And then they followed that gorge until eventually they reached the sea. And the shepherd had told her that if they just walked along the coast a bit, turned left, he would show her the fossils, the bones that he knew were there. So they did. And you can just imagine this kind of anticipation. I mean, it's 4 hours of travel to get there, and her last day. He took her to the place, and there was nothing there. Just a few fragments, what she called a sort of last faint memory of a bone cave. Nothing left, it had been weathered away. At that moment, a lesser person, someone made of less stern stuff, probably would have just given up. It was the 22nd of July, midsummer. It was probably about midday by that point, so the heat would have been blistering. Beastly hot, she wrote in her diaries. And she still had to go back and pack and get all the stuff that she had found all ready to go home back to the UK for study. I'd have been tempted to go back to Hania and have a nice meal, maybe a wash, possibly. But when she went back to the mouth of the gorge, she met another shepherd. You do meet shepherds quite a bit, even today in the Mediterranean. And this shepherd, asking what they were doing, this single woman, English, on her own with just one guide, 26 years old, it was 1904, Mrs. Quite an impressive woman, Dorothea Bate. He said, "Oh yeah, I know some bones, they're the other way." Even then, you start to think of Dorothea Bate sort of poised, deciding what should she do? Go back 4 hours? She's still got 4 hours worth of travelling to do, or should she just follow it? Should she just follow it? Of course she should. Dorothea Bate. Oh no. Dorothea Bate. Dorothea Bate would never let such a chance go to waste. She turned right. And turning right and walking along this really, really, really rough, bare, exposed cliff along the seaside, very, very, very bright white rock. You can really imagine it glaring under the sun. And it's really, really, really uneven. You have to scramble up and down into crevasses. It's not particularly steep, but it really does wear you out. Even in January, when I was there, it was pretty hot. Eventually, after about an hour or so, you will come, as Dorothea Bate did, to, on this cliff, this kind of strange pinkish red sediment that's hard as nails, and it protrudes upwards out of the cliff. It's so hard, this sediment, that it seems to be harder than the cliffs around it. It seems to be weathering more slowly, and in that sediment you will find fossils. Now, you can see from Dorothea Bates' diaries, and she's not really given to much decoration of prose, how excited she was, because she writes, "At last, this is the place that I have been looking for." And I have to say, when I saw those fossils, I felt exactly the same way. I felt like this is the place that I have been looking for, because I was looking for Dorothea Bates' locality, and I have to say that a few little tears were shed by me and the guy I was with when we were there, because we were so excited. We thought we would never, ever find anything as good as this, because she'd found it. She had found the first evidence of a dwarf elephant on Crete. Now, Dorothea Bate was really the last in a line of pioneering Victorian and Edwardian explorers who were looking around the Mediterranean for fossils at that time. She was there in Crete in 1904, she'd been to Cypress in 1901 and 1902, and on those trips she had two things with her. She had maps, which are mostly produced by a guy called Captain Spratt, Captain Thomas Abel Spratt of the Royal Navy, who spent most of the 1840s and 50s mapping the Mediterranean as part of his job. And she had a book, or a couple of books, which were the paleontological memoirs and notes of a man called Hugh Falconer. Now, Hugh Falconer was a real larger-than-life character, and it's an absolute shame, a crying shame, that he's been forgotten, because in his time, he was one of the major men of science. He was friends with Darwin, he was definitely not friends with Owen, he was part of the in-group, if you like, and he was really up there with sort of the great thinkers. He was the guy who is credited partly with introducing tea plantations to India. He is someone who collected several tons of fossils in the Similak Hills in the Himalayas. And those are a real cornerstone of the Natural History Museum's mammal collection, our fossil mammal collection. He sent 10 tons back from his time in India. And one of the key things that he was involved with is establishing the real antiquity of man. At a time we weren't really sure how old the world was, back in the mid 19th century. We weren't really sure how long humans had been around. He was really involved with the debates and the controversies surrounding just how old humanity was. And he was very instrumental in establishing the authenticity of certain stone tools in deposits in France. And to sort of bring it more through to the present day, Hugh Falconer is also the guy that a very famous evolutionary biologist called Stephen Jay Gould credits with anticipating his theory of punctuated equilibria. Because whilst Hugh Falconer was a friend of Darwin's, they didn't agree on everything, because Hugh Falconer didn't see the same amount of evidence that Darwin saw for evolution by natural selection, certainly not gradualistic change through time. He wrote to Darwin almost exactly 161 years. This is from September 1962, this letter. He wrote to Darwin, now the glacial period, he was working on the glacial period with his elephants, was no joke, he said to Darwin. He saw in his fossils no evidence for evolutionary change. He said this glacial period would have made ducks and drakes of your dear pigeons and doves. Because for Falconer, he was working on the fossil record of elephants from the glacial period, and he was convinced that he didn't see much evidence of evolutionary change. Instead, he saw stasis. That's a bit of a segue. You should bear it in mind because it does influence really, I think, the way he interpreted and the way he worked on the fossils we're going to talk about now. Because Captain Spratt, the guy who Dorothea Bate was working from the maps of, had been stationed in Malta in the 1860s. And when he was stationed in Malta, he had come across some fossil teeth that he recognised as being the teeth of fossil elephants. And when he investigated the source of these teeth, he found a whole spoil heap left over from the excavations of a well, which was absolutely jam-packed full of more fossils. And because Hugh Falconer was the go-to guy at the time for understanding anything really about fossil elephants, he sent these fossils to Hugh Falconer. And Hugh Falconer looked at them, and he thought for a bit, because he was a really cautious man. He didn't want to make a mistake. He was really worried that if he looked at these small elephant teeth, he didn't want to pronounce them as something new and different. Firstly, as I already said, he was a guy who saw stasis, not change. But secondly, he didn't want to misidentify a small elephant tooth as a pygmy elephant or a dwarf elephant if it was, in fact, a baby. He wanted more evidence, and he sent Spratt back and said, can't you look for a bit more? And so Spratt persuaded, I don't know how he did this, Spratt persuaded the guys whose well it was, Senior Boutier, he persuaded him to let him go into his water tank and actually re-excavate into the side of the cave. I mean, I don't know, it's not recorded whether they drained the well or anything, but Spratt did it and he found more stuff. And these are the original drawings that Falconer had made by a guy called Joseph Dinkle, and these are Falconer's notes all over them. And this is the first tooth, and probably the nicest tooth in the collections. And he was worried about it because he thought it did look a bit like an adult elephant tooth, but it didn't have all the distinctive features that he would have liked to have seen. But when Spratt came back with things like this, which is also an elephant tooth, but a baby elephant tooth, Falconer knew that he was looking at the large end of a very small-sized elephant spectrum. So he was like, yep, 2 years later, it took him to get around to doing this. He was like, yep, that's a new species. And he named it Elephas melitensis. Just to confuse you all, from now on, I'm going to call it Paleoloxodon melitensis. I'll explain later. If only I could call it Elephas, there are less syllables. So, 1862, he and Spratt together went to the summer meeting, the annual meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, now the British Science Association, and they announced their new species to the great and the good of the scientific community, because in those days, anybody who was anybody in the British science community would have been at the British Association for the Advancement of Science meeting. Clearly not now, because you're all here with me, not in Newcastle. No, that's very, very mean. No, but they announced their species to everyone who was there, and Elephas melitensis, Paleoloxodon melitensis, was basically in the scientific lexicon from that point onwards. It was the first example of a dwarf elephant that anyone had ever known existed, and it caused kind of a furore. It made the popular press. This was a tapir-sized elephant, they estimated. They only really had teeth and a few bits of skeletal material. They knew it would be tiny, pig-sized, a really, really, really small beast. But otherwise, like an elephant, it matched its an elephant in all its particulars except its size. And that started a flurry of interest in the area. And there was a lot of interest in natural history at that time. This here, I'm afraid it's not a very good picture, but I couldn't find a better one, is a man called Andrew Leith Adams. And he was also, like Captain Spratt, a military man. But he was in the army, he wasn't in the navy. And he was stationed on Malta, also in the 1860s and 1870s, as the doctor to, I think, the 22nd Regiment. And because Malta was quite a nice place to be stationed at, there weren't really much fighting, so there wasn't many wounds, and it was very, very, it didn't have many diseases or epidemics. He had a lot of free time. And in his free time, he went off geologizing and looking at birds and doing all kinds of fun sort of natural history stuff, and then writing books about it. He writes books with very similar titles, like Notes for a Naturalist in the Nile Valley and Malta, Ramblings in India, that kind of thing. But they're lovely sort of travelogues of his adventures and finds at the same time. And when he was on Malta, he had a lot of free time. He did a lot of excavating, and he found a lot of material, far more material than Captain Spratt ever excavated. There's some of it here. And in all this material, he didn't just find fossils of dwarf elephants. He found extensive amounts of fossils of tiny hippos, not as small as the elephants, but small nonetheless, giant swans and giant dormice. Really quite unusual bunch of stuff. These are all elephant teeth, because that's what I work on, it's my collections. And this is, I just want to read this something that he wrote. I'll accompany it by a rather beautiful painting that a guy called Bob Nichols made. It's lovely, isn't it? So this is from Leith Adams, 1870. A bit adapted. I would fain attempt to prepare him, you the reader, for what I have to say of ancient Malta. Tall reeds must have fringed the banks of its lakes, rivers and lagoons, and tree and shrub must have flourished in profusion, for the now waterless wastes and dry gorges didn't like water very much. Seen here and there over the little island, once resounded with the snorting of the hippopotamus and the shrill trumpets of strange elephants, and were part and parcel of a land, the major portion of which is now under the blue waters of the Mediterranean. So you can see, from his finds, he was already envisaging a quite extraordinary land, quite different to the one that was there today. And he thought, you might have heard the word plural there, elephants. He wasn't just referring to many elephants. He thought he saw evidence for not just one species of small-sized elephant, but a second. But he also knew that Falconer hadn't yet published his description of Melitensis, of Paleoxylon melitensis. He'd spoken about it, but he hadn't published it. And so really there was a bit of a kind of a holding off, waiting for Falconer to do his thing before Leith Adams would get in and describe his second species. So he waited and he waited and he waited, and then Falconer died without publishing. Now, this is also from Leith Adams' book. I want to point it out because Leith Adams, I think, well, let's just say I think he was a great talent for backhanded compliments. This is what he wrote on the occasion of Falconer's death. Perhaps few paleontologists of Dr. F's vast experience communicated so little to the world. At the same time, as is apparent from his writings, that whatever he touched he adorned. Study, care and caution mark all his labours. Of him it might truly be said, if he did little, that little was always well done. Oh, yeah, I've got mixed feelings about Andrew Leith Adams. Anyway, but it was true. What Hugh Falconer did, he did do very well, which is kind of sad when we look at how it's panned out for him. Because Falconer's untimely death really hit his friends in London pretty hard. They were completely bowled away by it, and with people like Leith Adams around calling him lazy, effectively, there was a real sort of sense of need to kind of rescue his reputation. So they got together and they decided to publish his notes, all the notes he hadn't published for him, edit them, put them together. 1,400 pages it came to, 2 volumes, and that's what Dorothea Bate took with her to Crete. And as well as that, a guy called George Busk was given the task by Captain Spratt to finish off what Falconer started, to work up the material from the Budge Cave in Malta and to publish Falconer's description of the species alongside it. Now, Busk was a dear friend of Hugh Falconer. He'd excavated with him in Malta, travelled in the Mediterranean, they were close friends, and you could really get a sense that he wanted to commemorate the memory of his friend. When he looked through this material with Spratt's and Falconer's notes, he was fairly sure, now Busk was a medical surgeon, he wasn't an expert on fossil elephants, he was fairly sure that he saw evidence for more than one species of small-sized elephant there. And it wasn't the same one as Leith Adams, he was sure, it was yet another species, and he was going to name it in honour of his dear departed friend. Of course he was. So he found evidence of a second small-sized species that wasn't that different to Hugh Falconer's, and he named it Elephas, well, Falconeri, I guess, but now we do most of our work in Italy. The Italians have kind of rechristened it Falconeri, so it's Paleoxylon falconeri these days. He named the species after his friend, and, well, we'll come to the problems it caused a bit later, because, really, that's what they were there for, to describe species, to describe the diversity they'd found there, and very little was really discussed about what this diversity might have meant, what these dwarf elephants might have meant about the Malta of the past. Now, Falconer had also done a bit of excavating in Sicily, and he'd found more evidence of dwarf hippopotamus and dwarf elephants. So there was a real sense that the Maltese story and the Sicily story was linked. And our old friend Captain Spratt, his work mapping the Mediterranean, it wasn't just mapping the islands, it was also taking soundings of the sea and mapping the seafloor for Royal Navy purposes. He was a very skilled cartographer, and this is a sounding map that he did of the area. Here's Sicily, that's the toe of Italy. This is Malta here, and this is the African coast. That's Tripoli. Now, this light grey area is, if you like, it's a bathymetric map. It's a contour, and that contour is 200 fathoms. So that's what I have to check my notes if I ever can remember. 200 fathoms is it's apparently 360 meters. Can't be. It must be the way around. Anyway, so it's quite deep. But his point here, when he was looking at these shallow waters here, is that Spratt, when he saw the presence of elephants on Malta, his first thought was, elephants? Oh, hippos? Oh. And then somebody else found some hyena. He was like, these look like African animals. So he saw the presence of these animals on Malta as evidence that actually Africa and Malta were some way connected. And similarly, Malta and Sicily were some way connected, again, borne out by the fact that similar animals seem to be found there. They took the presence of these animals as evidence for previous connections between lands that are no longer there. And Spratt actually believed that current-day Malta had subsided catastrophically, causing a huge tsunami, and a huge tsunami was actually what deposited the bones in these fissures that he'd excavated. That was his theory. It's not correct. That was his theory. And so really, what we had here for these three elephants for the people of that time was not so much evidence of interesting evolution, but evidence of times past that were different. Something had changed. Now, I find this quite extraordinary that nothing more was asked. But really, they were just interested in this. They were basically, okay, we've got one medium-sized elephant, one slightly smaller dwarf elephant, and one slightly larger dwarf elephant. Yeah, it gets a bit of a tongue twister. You think of it like Goldilocks and the Three Bears. You've sort of got small, smaller, and smallest or something. Small, smaller, smallest. You've got these three different species, and they were evidence of maybe that we had some African animals once living in Europe. Now, this gets quite interesting because you've got to remember that at the same time, all this investigation was going on across the whole of mainland Europe, and they were only then really cataloguing the diversity of our fossil past across Europe as well. Now, whilst it makes sense to us today that maybe they do African, hippo, elephant, hyena, you do think an African fauna, but it becomes clear if you look at the fossil record for Europe that actually you've got elephants and hippos and things like that all across continental Europe. And you have species of elephant that are no longer in existence at all. There's a group called the straight-tusked elephants, which is the genus Paleoloxodon, which is what I've been using. And we're pretty sure that the elephants from Malta and Sicily are descendants of this straight-tusked elephant that lived in Europe. Let's go back here. You can see, this is a drawing from 1940. Can you see these funny little ridges? They've got these little lumps on their heads. That's an indication that the paleo artist has basically filled in the information for this and thinks that it's got this kind of special ridge bit, which is diagnostic of this straight-tusked elephant group. Now, this is a full-size skull of a straight-tusked elephant. This is me, in case you haven't worked it out. There's its tusks, there's its nose hole, that's its brow ridge, eyes on the side, so the trunk would have come down here. As you can see, it's a really big animal. But it wasn't until a guy called Hans Pohlig, he was really post-Darwinian, he was into evolution. He was totally about evolution. Hans Pohlig, a German paleontologist, and in Germany they've got loads of fossils of straight-tusked elephants. He was the first person that kind of made this connection. The straight-tusked elephants on Sicily and Malta were actually like these elephants on the mainland of Europe and not necessarily African fauna. This is him leaning nonchalantly, somewhat, on the thigh bone of a straight-tusked elephant. And so that's the thigh bone. And you can see it's quite big. He wasn't a tiny man. It's like 4 foot 11 inches from top to bottom, so nearly 5 foot, just its thigh bone. So this elephant would have been about 4 meters tall at the shoulder and probably would have weighed somewhere in the region of 10 tons. As a comparison, a big African male bull will be about 7 tons. So these extinct elephants in Europe, which were there at the same time as some of the mammoths, were massive, bigger than the living elephants. And I'm showing you this, and this next picture here, just to get your eye in for size. This is actually the shin bone of a straight-tusked elephant. It's me again, the scale. So, shin bone of a straight-tusked elephant, and it's not even fully grown. So in mammals, you can tell when something's fully grown if the ends of its bones have fused. And you can see here, there's kind of an open line around like that, between that and there. And actually, the bottom, it hasn't even got its articular surface because it's fallen away, because it hasn't knitted up properly. If it was fully grown, it would have knitted up and they'd be perfectly there. So this is the big shin bone, or not fully grown, probably a teenager, straight-tusked elephant, from Essex, like me. And this is the same bone from a tiny elephant from a cave in Sicily. Now we call this one, the species, this is Paleoloxon falconeri, and this is an adult, because it's definitely fused. No line there, no line there, it's definitely stopped growing. Now I could hold that between my finger and my thumb, and an animal with a shin bone of that size would probably have been under a metre tall as an adult. So that's smaller, a bit smaller than a newborn baby African elephant. Very, very cute. But it was, so I bring this up to give you an idea of the size, but also this is really the first evidence of anyone even starting to think about evolution or descent for these dwarf elephants at all, and establishing they weren't really African animals, but they were European animals. But not much really happened then. When Dorothea Bate came along on the scene in 1901, and she was only in her early 20s, she had Pony to thank for the fact that he kind of linked the fact that it was an island thing. He was like, these are island races of the straight-tusked elephant. So when she wanted to go fossil hunting somewhere exciting, and she had some friends who worked in the diplomatic service in Cyprus, she was like, aha, a Mediterranean island, I'm interested in fossils, I reckon there's a good chance I might find a dwarf elephant there. And sure enough, she did. She found a new species of dwarf elephant on Cyprus, absolutely tiny as well, probably another 1 metre tall elephant. And then, of course, she went to Crete looking for the same thing. And eventually, she was rewarded. So by the end, of the first decade of the 20th century, we had in the Mediterranean quite a few species of dwarf elephant of different sizes. We had, in the tiny small camp, Paleoloxon falconeri, thanks to Busk. And we also had Bate species, Paleoloxon cypriotes and Paleoloxon creticus. In the medium-sized camp, we had Paleoloxon melitensis from Malta, and also people thought from Sicily. Basically, the assumption was now that Sicily and Malta were connected, and so anything on Malta was probably going to be on Sicily too. And then this kind of large-sized dwarf elephant, which is probably only still 2 metres tall or something like that, just over, Paleoloxon menadriensis. And that's kind of how it stayed. Not much else happened for a long time, except one very sad thing, which was when people stopped researching on Malta and the research interest shifted to Sicily, and the Sicilian researchers didn't really find any evidence at all for a medium-sized dwarf elephant. Poor old Falconer's species got cut out. Well, at least he got his name left. That was all that was left. But otherwise, nothing really much else was done. And I really find that surprising. I find it quite extraordinary that over about 50 years worth of research, most of it happening after the publication of The Origin of Species, no one really asked any massive questions like, why does this happen? I mean, mostly they talked about these small-sized races as maybe being degenerate or stunted, and they were on their way to extinction. And certainly in the early work, if they talked about islands at all, they talked about islands as being the cause of the extinction, not the cause of the small body size or the change, the evolution in the first place. You've got quite a long time before you start to get to what I think of as the age of ideas. And this guy here, this is Paul Sondar, Dutch paleontologist in the 1970s, as you can probably guess. But this is him in Crete. Now, Paul Sondar was pretty much the first person in the late 60s, this was, to put forward a decent evolutionary hypothesis for dwarf elephants and dwarf hippos and dwarf deer on these islands in the Mediterranean. And he called it his island theory of dwarfism. He basically said that he felt that the amount of dwarfism that occurred was an indication of how isolated, of how insular the environment was, and that the animals were adapted to that environment. Now, that makes him like a massive pioneer, but he wasn't really working from nothing. He was working off the back of a really, really important seminal text. He published his idea, his theory of dwarfism, in 1967, which was the same year that this book was published, and which really, really changed things across the lot. Because in the 60s, islands were a hot topic. Not just dwarf elephants, actually dwarf elephants, bless them, weren't really a hot topic. They were kind of mostly being forgotten about. But islands were a really hot topic. They were being used for all kinds of things to answer big evolutionary questions, because people saw them as great experiments, natural experiments in testing evolutionary theory. And they also saw them as having really interesting patterns that needed to be explained. And one of those patterns was to do with the biodiversity of those islands, the number of species that was on them. And this book here, by MacArthur and Wilson, came up with a really, really elegant model to explain the number of species that you find on islands. And they said it was all down to the interaction of two very basic things, the rate of immigration and the rate of extinction. And those two things varied in a predictable manner with the geography of the islands, because immigration rate would be higher nearer to land, and extinction rate would be higher on smaller islands where everything was a bit more pressured. So you come up there with a theory that small islands that are a long way away should have fewer species on them than big islands that are near to the mainland. That very simple thing is what got Paul Sondar thinking, because really where he came from was that he was looking across the Mediterranean and seeing different patterns on different islands. He was asking himself, why are there 3 species of dwarf elephant on Sicily and Malta, but only 1 species on Cypress, when they're 2 big islands? And he came up with the idea that it was something to do with the dispersal effect. And he said that basically the islands that were far away were colonised by a sweepstakes method. Individuals getting washed into the sea at various points and maybe getting there, but it was hard to do. Whereas islands that were close, like Sicily, may have had land bridges in the past and would have enabled dispersal in a much easier way. He was applying these basic theories to the premise of dwarf elephants, but really he just left it at the theory point. That's where we have to sort of depart from the dwarf elephants for a second, because this didn't just start Paul Sondar thinking, it also started a lot of some seriously brainy people got onto the bandwagon, if you like. This guy here is Leith Adams. Leith Adams was a dude. He, I think if anyone's interested in academic publishing, people should remember Leith Adams and the power of his work. He didn't really think much of journals, so he started his own. He typed it, called it evolutionary theory, and he kind of typed his own papers in his own journals and had a lot of his theories there. You can now get them all online for free. But he came up with a lot of really awesome things. So even though he had his own island rule. Now, he didn't develop or notice the pattern. That was in the 1960s by a guy called Foster, who'd looked at deer and rabbits and I think rodents on islands off the coast of Canada, and noticed that deer often got smaller and some of the rabbits and the rodents got bigger. And he'd made this description. But Leith Adams thought about it a lot, and he coined it and called it the island rule. This guy had a talent for naming things. But he didn't really, he didn't sort of go into much more detail. He just kind of explored the ideas in terms of the dynamics of population, extinction, and immigration, how they could all affect each other and feed back on each other in really, really complicated maths, which we won't go into. But he coined the term the island rule, saying that for him, this basically meant that small herbivorous mammals increase in size, carnivores, ungulates and insectivores become smaller. So it was quite specific, it wasn't quite general. A guy called Mark Lomolino, he's the person who took that term, the island rule, and expanded it into the thing we think of it as today, which is he saw it not as a specific way of describing what happens to these individual groups, but as a more general pattern that could be applied across all of mammals. And he really explained it thus, in a nice, hard to interpret graph for you all. But don't worry, you haven't got to worry about it because it's really simple to explain it. He basically said big things get small and small things get big in mammals on islands, which of course, you think back to our findings by Andrew Leith Adams, Lomolino, not just the rule, but an attempt to explain it. And his suggestion was that the factors for things getting bigger on islands, these small mammals, was because they were being released from all kinds of pressures on the mainland. They were being released from things like competition. Whereas for things that were getting smaller, they were being affected more by other aspects, by the resource limitation inherent to islands. And this is the beginning of a swathe of discussion about what causes size change on islands. You get a suggestion of competition, less competition on islands, predation, less predation on islands, lack of resources, a change in feeding niche, or immigrant selection. Some things are just better at getting to islands if you're optimal body size, which actually kind of encompass all of them together, which is there's a kind of a sweet spot where you can perfectly balance the energy that you invest in growing and the energy you invest in reproduction, and that every animal will try to evolve towards that sweet spot given half a chance. Now, I've coloured these in because whilst there are always different theories, I tend to think of them as kind of being linked together. And I think of some of them as being permissive, things that on islands, that things where when you're on an island, that basically the island environment allows you to evolve, and things that are restrictive, whereas the island environment is kind of forcing you to evolve. It's as simple as that. Colour blue is permissive, the island gives you new opportunities, and red is restrictive, it removes opportunities. And I've lined them up like this, just so you can sort of see them there. Now, feeding niche, of course, being complex, gets split in two, because the idea being that an island will, on average, have fewer niches, because it's a smaller area, but if it's also got fewer species on it, there might be the opportunity to move into new niches. So if you're a specialist, then moving to an island could be restrictive because your niche might not be there and you may be in trouble. But if you're a generalist, it doesn't matter because there might be empty niches you can move into, so it can work two ways. This is the kind of thinking behind it. And the reason why I'm really ramming this home and trying to get you to think about these things is to go and think back to island biogeography and this idea that the number of species on an island can be explained by simple aspects of geography: island area and distance from the mainland, immigration rate, extinction rate. Because immediately you see the number of species links all of these things together via the geography of the islands themselves. Resources are going to be affected by island area, and the number of species can be affected by area and distance from the mainland. These things are never really going to be independent of one another. They're going to vary together, which I may suggest might explain why the debates of which of these is the most important thing rumble on to this day. It's quite hard to tease them apart. And the debates do rumble on. They rumble on quite a bit. And that's why I kind of move on to what I think of as the age of controversy. The island rule in mammals. You get a name like the island rule and it sticks. People love a rule. And it particularly sticks outside of the field of interest. So when people like Van Valen coined it, they were people at the cutting edge of the mathematical models for looking at population dynamics and evolution. But that term, the island rule, filtered out everywhere. And it was nice and simple, particularly when Loma Lido says big things get small and small things get big. It's a great thing. It's also great for testing and writing papers about. But Lomolino, over the years, between 85 when he first published his more general theory and to the early start of the 21st century, he saw more and more evidence from more and more different groups of animals that this island rule was everywhere. He basically came to the conclusion that it was quite general. It was more general than just mammals alone. And as he got ready to publish that idea, a guy called Shy Mary and colleagues, Shy was doing his PhD, I think, on carnivores, came up with something quite different. They were working on carnivores, and he saw no evidence for the island rule in carnivores. So this thing, the island rule, had become kind of entrenched. It was taught in textbooks, it was taught in universities, and it's nice and neat and tidy, and it sounds lovely and plausible. So when he saw that there was no evidence in carnivores, you can see that he was thinking, this is interesting. He published this almost simultaneously with Lomolino going, it's everywhere, it's completely general. It is quite general if you look across everything. So the data, it's not that either one was wrong, they're just looking at different data sets. And so, of course, as is the way, you get a bit of backwards and forwards saying, oh, no, it isn't. Oh, yes, it is. Oh, no, it isn't. Oh, yes, it is. And then, oh, yes, it is. Oh, dear. Anyway, like this. And so, no, too far ahead. Until really, I think in some ways, it kind of was probably the most influential, a bit of a coup de grace by Shy Mary, when Shy took a more general data set beyond his carnivores and he applied what we call the comparative method, which basically just means correcting for the evolutionary tree behind it. And he took the data set that everyone was mostly using and looking for these general trends of big things getting small and small things getting big. If you removed the effects of evolution, effectively, sort of the background evolutionary data, the sort of related to the species, you lost the island rule. It wasn't significant anymore. And what instead seemed to be happening was a few key groups who changed in size a lot, as in they did it quite often, and they also had a large size change. So they got very, very small or very, very big relative to their mainland size, were skewing the broad trend across many animals. So, where are we? Is there an island rule? Can we be generalistic about assuming that big things on islands get small, small things get big? Well, people working on these kind of areas are kind of suggesting no, not so much. Maybe it's more complicated than sort of broad brush macroevolutionary approaches. But of course, at the same time, this is all happening 2004, 2005, through to a bit later. At the same time, there's another controversy going on. There we go. Yeah, The Hobbit. Hobbit was published in 2004, Homo floresiensis. Evidence for a small-sized human on an Indonesian island that the people who found it claim is a new species, and which is pretty much now accepted as a completely new species of small-sized ancient human. There's still controversy, but I think pretty much the consensus is that it's not a pathological human. But of course, what's really interesting about this controversy, the Homo floresiensis debate, is that some of the best evidence in favour of it being a new species is that people could explain its size change as a large animal that got smaller on islands, in line with the island rule. It makes sense. It could happen. The island rule is kind of universal. So it kind of set the scene for a kind of parallel debate that was going on at the same time, which I found quite interesting. They never really gelled, actually, those two things. And it gets particularly interesting if you think that if it is important to understand the nuances of why these things get small on islands, and it isn't general, and if instead what you see is maybe certain groups of herbivores getting smaller, whereas things like carnivores are kind of doing all kinds of things and tracking their prey. Well, I don't know, I'm not an anthropologist, but it starts to make me want to ask questions. Well, where does the Hobbit fit into this if it's hunting stegodons on Flores? Herbivore, carnivore? I don't know. It's one of those interesting questions, things that I don't think have been answered, but the controversy rumbles on. And I think no one's answering it. And, but whilst I would say the island rule controversy can go backwards and forwards a little bit still, we've got apparently evidence for island dwarf dinosaurs. And then there's even, people have suggested, in deep sea mollusks, the island rule in the deep sea. So they've seen the same trend, small things getting big and big things getting small, and said, hey, it's the island rule, therefore is the deep sea or places in it, the abyss, kind of like islands? Because, of course, the island rule is kind of tempting in general. I'll leave you to ponder. But the most important thing that it means is really, I suppose, that for us, from my point of view, from the dwarf elephant point of view, the island rule doesn't really necessarily matter as long as we don't assume it is working for all of the species on those islands at the same time and use that assumption to underpin other inferences, which I'll come to in a second. We had our own controversies to worry about because with The Hobbit, people started to get interested in dwarf elephants again. If you find a human, an ancient human, then suddenly anything connected with them that might previously have been very, very dull suddenly becomes a lot more fascinating to lots and lots of people. And Mediterranean pygmy elephants became a slightly hotter topic. And, basically, it became quite interesting for me because I wanted to find out where my elephants fitted in the family tree and ask some really basic questions. And just as I was doing this, a paper got published that said they'd found ancient DNA in dwarf elephant material from Crete, and they said it was from the species that Dorothea Bate had found. It was from the same site that Dorothea Bate had been to. And even more extraordinarily, they said that this material, this ancient DNA, was from fossils that were over 800,000 years old, which at the time would have been the oldest ancient DNA ever amplified. And this ancient DNA evidence said that the elephants from that site were not straight-tusked elephants. They weren't Paleoloxodon. They were actually mammoths. They were in the genus Mammuthus. Now, that's a series of quite extraordinary and interesting claims. Oh, no, wrong one. And when you make extraordinary and interesting claims, people respond quite quickly. In the ancient DNA community, they fell down like a ton of bricks on this poor paper, probably quite rightly. And immediately there were responses, basically, two responses. I don't think anything with a question mark, often the answer is no, right? Two responses, and they said things like, significantly methodologically flawed. The basic upshot was that it was a very short sequence anyway, just 43 base pairs of DNA, which is a very, very tiny sequence. And in that sequence, there were three unique base pairs that suggested this was a mammoth. And the criticism was that 2 of those base pairs were actually in the section of DNA that was used to amplify the whole sequence, so they were kind of an artifact. And then of that one piece of evidence remaining, that was also found in living elephants, so it wasn't a good mammoth character. So that sort of dealt with the DNA aspect of it not being a mammoth. There wasn't any good evidence for it being a mammoth. It could have been DNA from various elephant species, and the data was poor, not very robust anyway. The other aspect, of course, that they didn't deal with as ancient DNA people was this 800,000-year-old claim, which I think sparked the response, because it's kind of like, seriously, 800,000-year-old DNA? You've got to be pretty certain to prove that. But they didn't question the geology. I, however, doing my PhD work at the time, could question the geology. It just wasn't that old. Well, we don't know it's not that old. We just don't know how old it is. That 800,000-year-old date was based on a site completely elsewhere in Crete. And not only that, it was based on, on a technique that is no longer used today, completely discredited by geochronologists. So it's an age that makes no sense even within its own internal logic, but also doesn't actually hold water in modern methods. And so it kind of begged the question, what was going on here? Is there, basically, I was like, I kind of wanted to look into it. I was kind of sort of, okay, you sort of see this thing and you see it, you kind of go, okay, it's not changed. Good old Dorothea Bate was right after all, hooray, phew. And then you go and look at the specimen. And things change again, because that's what I was doing. I was going back and I was looking at her old work and looking at her old pieces and looking at her old fossils. And of course, we had her notes and her maps, and we knew about her sites. And so we were fairly confident that we knew these locations, we knew there was material there, so he could have easily have collected material there. But when we actually looked at the fossils to see what was going on, all you need to do is take one quick look at the morphology of these teeth, as I'm sure you all can be, having your eye on for elephant teeth here, but just trust me on this. This shape here on the surface of the teeth, this is the grinding surface, you're looking down on the top of the surface. This shape is very, very diagnostic of mammoths. So Poulakakis was right, but for the wrong reasons, in some respects. Dorothea Bates' identification of it as a straight-tusked elephant wasn't correct. It was actually a mammoth from that site, which is interesting. And even more interesting for us, when you look at the fossils, because the teeth are so very short, this is the top, the bottom, it's actually quite short for an elephant tooth. That suggested to us that it wasn't just a mammoth, it was a very early mammoth. This looks most like the teeth from the first mammoths that arrived in Europe, and they got into Europe about 3.5 million years ago. So, again, whilst there was no evidence that it was older than 800,000 years, if it was descended from this southern mammoth, this very, very first mammoth in Europe, it could easily be as old as 3.5 million years. So we also happen to find some really nice things like bits of fossil skeleton, which meant we can measure its arm length. This is actually a cross-section of its arm. That's where the shoulder would articulate. That's where the elbow would be. And it's an adult because it's all fused up. We could measure that. 30 centimetres gave us a shoulder height of just over 1 metre. So he definitely knew we had a tiny, tiny, teeny mammoth like that. But that's not really what's important, I suppose. It's really interesting if you're keen on taxonomy and stuff like that. But we wanted to put all this stuff into a broader context. If you want to get at the whys, you need to have the basic underpinning variation for what's going on. And we wanted, in particular, to get those ultimate drivers because, I haven't got time, have I? Never mind. Because we figured that if all these suggestions for the causes of iron dwarfism, competition, predation, resource limitation, etc., 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 seem to co-vary with basic things like island area and distance from the mainland, then you need to consider one of the key factors that was also going on in the European area and across the whole world at the time these elephants were living, and that was periodical, dramatic climatic changes, ice ages every 100,000 years. So certainly for the last 800,000 years, we've got quite a record probably before, every 100,000 years ago, a huge ice age, a huge ice sheet would form, and that would cause the sea level to drop considerably, seriously considerably. We're talking like 120 metres below the current sea level. And when that happens, you see a dramatic shift in the geography of areas like the Mediterranean. Suddenly places like Sicily become connected to Italy and to Malta, just like Spratt suggested, although his 300 fathoms was too deep. The effect is the same, not to Africa, but to each other. Whereas islands like Crete and Cyprus are still islands, but they're much, much closer to the mainland than they would be during a warm stage. So those are doing good times, if you like, for things to get there, quite like to get there. And so linking those things into it and putting them together, we want to see, what can we say to explain the evolution of small-sized elephants and large-sized elephants, and maybe some medium-sized elephants, because I'm pretty sure they do exist, and put them into the context of climate change. And that was basically what we were trying to do, work out what elephants were living where and when, because without those 3 bits of information, which we just did not have, we could just talk ourselves around in circles. We didn't even know, for example, if the elephants on Sicily and Malta really are the same species, really were the same species, and we certainly didn't know whether they were living together at the same time. Hence, the return. Following Dorothea's footsteps. I just can't believe that she must have done this in her Edwardian garb. It's quite extraordinary. We shouldn't have done this. We should have waited. We were so excited that we finally found the cave because we had these notes and it was just too exciting. And it said, look, stalagmite, which is very, very, very exciting because we can date that. And sure enough, it was there. And we've got this place, so we could actually start to put the fossils we've got in the collections into a proper, robust, chronological and systematic framework. And what's really great is that we can do that properly. We can start to unpick theories that have been based on the presence of these endemic elephants. Now, because on Sicily, we've got these tiny, tiny species, these 1 metre tall elephants from Sicily and Malta, people have interpreted that as actually evidence for the fact that in the past, Sicily could not have been a big island. Because based on this idea that how islandy you are, how island the island is, should affect the amount of dwarfism that occurred a la Sonda, the interpretation is that a small elephant couldn't have evolved on a large island. But of course, you then get into a very circular argument if you haven't got any independent data. So this is the interpretation of how Sicily looked in the early Pleistocene, based on the idea that it was populated by a tiny species of elephant, 1 metre tall. We're trying to sort of get at how old those elephants were. We can't necessarily test the geography, but we certainly want to find out how old they are because we know Etna. A lot about the formation of Etna, and that just sort of starts to tie in with that. And whilst I can't tell you the dates, we have been in Spinnegallow Cave, the home of thousands and thousands of those tiny little shin bones, and we have got some awesome dates, which are surprisingly young. Watch this space. And I'm going to race through and just leave you with one little final thought. Because poor old Hugh Falconer, he lost his species, Elephas melitensis. It got taken away, dismissed from the taxonomic record, although I suspect it may return at some point. He did good work. He was a pretty smart guy. But it all started with him. He described the first dwarf elephant, and so we ought to let him end. And I wanted to end with a letter that he wrote to his niece Grace, because I think it's relevant. This is what I want to read out of it. He was here in the Geological Society. We almost lost him. Would you believe it? A heavy bookcase over the mantelpiece of the Geological Society fell on my head. And but for having my hat on, good hats in those days, I might have been killed. I was felled like an ox. Who wants to go to the library and have a drink? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Little did I know when I came here we'd be having an old health and safety claim against the society. I'll check our records. You can accept a few questions?
Oh, yeah.
Fire away now. Who should we got? Hands up first. Gentleman in the jacket.
You obviously focus on elephants.
Hang on. Wait for the... There we go. Sorry, that's
and that was most interesting, but I suspect you looked at the rest of the ecology and predators and what else. Mm-hmm. Read a paper, I think it was Jared Diamond, on Flores, where the baby elephants were being eaten. Big lizards evolved to eat elephants. To what extent do you kind of find these kind of links, and to what extent, is this kind of helpful?
Yes, well, sadly for Jared Diamond, and I don't think it was, I mean, I think it was just the knowledge of the time, but actually that particular claim is not, well, I'm sure those giant Komodo dragons did eat some of the pygmy elephants, but it doesn't seem they evolved to become larger to eat them on islands, because actually the mainland size, body size of these Komodo dragon lizards is pretty big, sometimes bigger than. So there's no clear size change trend for those particular lizards. That's a specific case. But that is a really interesting point. So the carnivores, and that's some of the work that Shire did in his more broad analysis of modern carnivores, was that it seems they seem to track prey quite a bit and do different things in different places. And so it's just slightly more complex. So I think what you've got here is one of those really nice balances in biology, which is you really want to explain broad-scale patterns, quite understandably, with broad-scale trends, and they are there, and you can have broad-scale patterns, but within that, there's always the kind of the minutiae and the mess and the kind of like the smaller level patterns that are going on. And I guess the question is how you get from those kind of small variations to that bigger scale pattern, which is where the interesting questions are. Poor Jared, that particular statement's really good, but it's not true.
Who's next? Sir.
Thank you. Is there any evidence when the refuges joined up to larger land masses of the spread of these dwarf species back into the mainland? And could that be a mechanism for driving the evolution of smaller versions of larger taxa?
We think they just went extinct. But, I mean, yes, we generally assume it's unidirectional. Partly, and I think it's in terms of a theory, but it's pretty hard to test. So the fossil record, I don't know. I think there was a paper recently about reintroduction in the other direction for small mammals, but I'm not 100% sure how that's planned out because it's sort of more ecological level. But certainly for our dwarf elephants, on the islands where there's more than one species, like Sicily and Malta, it looks like you've got repeated sort of evolution. Getting to the island, evolution becomes smaller, extinction, then the whole process starts again because you see the whole rest of the faunal community turning over as well with it. So it looks like evolution, extinction. And I guess that kind of makes sense because if you're in a situation like Sicily, if you're getting there at low sea level, becoming isolated, evolving, and then in a situation with the ice age, repeated sea level changes, you become small in the absence of predators, potentially, or the absence of competitors. Sea level drops again, and you're a 1 metre tall elephant coming face to face with a cave lion. Doesn't always work out so well. I don't know, that's the kind of interpretation. That seems to be the case. Whereas we don't see on, say, islands like Cypress are more isolated, we don't see the same turnover, the same extinction, then re-evolution, extinction, re-evolution. It's just the one species there. So,
can we go around the back somewhere? There we
are. What you were just saying begs the question: what happened to the huge dormouse when?
Yeah, do you know what? I wish someone would tell me. So the thing is, what I found most extraordinary about doing this is actually how much we take for granted and how confident people seem to feel about what we knew about the Mediterranean and the fossil record on those islands. And the more I dug into the elephants, the more everything unravelled and had to go back to basics. Now, the elephants are like the poster boys for that area. I mean, pretty much every single paper that you care to read about island dwarfism, certainly before Homo floresiensis was discovered, and even now, pretty much every paper on the island rule will have in its first paragraph elephants 1 metre tall. It's kind of like everyone knows about them, but yet we still haven't really sorted out their taxonomy properly and got to the nitty-gritty of what was going on where, the kind of the good, decent data. So no one, if they've done it for dolphins, they certainly haven't done it for the giant dormouse. I would absolutely love somebody to do a PhD or something, or maybe a postdoc or something, just something to properly go in and reassess this stuff properly and look at it and see what's going on. It'd be so, so thrilling.
But I was going to add, the writer, that if miniaturization means extinction, then giganticism should mean it thrives.
Well, assuming that the gigantism is an insular response to things that are not present on islands that are present on the mainland, you'd expect that back in a mainland scenario, then the flip side will be true because it's lost its insular situation. But that's assuming that that's all correct. These are nice hypotheses. They make nice stories, but who knows how they'd hold up to the data.
And one more. There was a gentleman at the far back. There we are.
Thanks for your talk. I was wondering, the species that get larger, the species that get smaller, did you find, or were you able to work out if their lifespans changed accordingly? So the short-lived mice, if they start to live longer, and the pygmy elephants, if they start to have the lifespans of a medium-sized mammal?
That's a very good question. That's certainly the assumption that underpins a lot of the hypotheses for the size change in the first place. So the idea is that being smaller, you'll live a faster life, and vice versa, towards its optimum body size. But again, it's something which I think, because we know things like metabolic rate scale with size, so a mouse has much faster life than an elephant, and across that sort of thing, we know that's there. Using those kind of inter-species relationships, and then I think back imprinting them on what is almost a within-species size change, is, I think, more problematic than we realise. People do it, and we certainly in modelling, we sort of predict the sort of metabolic rate changes. But it gets really, really fascinating when you start to try and tease it apart, and it's hard to do, but there's some preliminary data which suggests that it might not be the case. Now, I'll start off with one piece of data, sort of as a kind of general thing. First of all, if you look at, say, artificial selection, look at dogs. Now, within dogs, small-sized dogs do not have a shorter, faster life than a large-sized dog. Oh, yeah, it's the other way around, I think. I think big dogs often have shorter lives within species. And then if you look at a really odd creature, actually originally discovered by Dorothea Bate, called Myotragus, the mouse goat from the Balearic Islands. I know, mouse goat, I know, it's not as small as a mouse. It's quite small, but it's not that small. But the weirdest thing about it is it has a tiny, tiny brain and these enormous front-facing eyes. It would have really good binocular vision. Usually, sort of goat-like things have got eyes on the side, looking to the side for predation reasons. They've got forward-facing eyes and these really, really weird teeth, these ever-growing incisors. And it's the ever-growing incisors that made her call it a mouse goat, because they look like mouse teeth, but quite big, obviously, like that big as opposed to that big. Anyway, the mouse goat is an island animal. And people working on that in Spain have been looking at counting growth markers in its bones and its teeth to kind of count up how long its life was and to get an idea of its life history. And you can do this because our cells have got daily rhythms. So if you were to cut through your teeth, you would see, like in tree rings, these tiny, tiny bands of daily growth. Because every day, for a little while, when your teeth were growing, your enamel cells stopped, took a rest, and then started again, creating a little line. We call these the stria rettius. And that's common across all mammals. If you can count up the number of days in a tooth, you can see how long a tooth took to form. And you can therefore extrapolate that out to the whole thing. Now, Myotragus didn't seem to be living a short, fast life. It seemed to be living a much slower life than you would have predicted, which was really, really interesting, because it kind of said, okay, maybe we can't assume these things are true. Then a colleague of mine, Wendy Dirks, who is a dental anthropologist, and she works mostly on counting these lines in the teeth of primates to understand primate life history. She's been trying to do in her spare time this for elephants, which is, pardon the pun, a mammoth task, because elephants' teeth don't grow like ours. Our teeth, we've got milk teeth, which kind of form our jaw, come up, erupt, fall out, that adult teeth comes up underneath them. And one of those teeth, which we call the M1, is pretty much there, present from birth, and so you can capture pretty much the most of childhood of a primate if you've got the M1 tooth, but looking inside it with all these little daily lines. Elephants' teeth don't grow up from the bottom like that, they grow in a conveyor belt from the back and they wear out at the front. So you never ever have an entire mouthful of teeth for starters, and you don't ever have, and you can't even find them lying around, you basically sort of they've lost them. And then on top of that, with dwarf elephants, how can we assume they're going to necessarily definitely have the same number of teeth in their jaw through life? Big elephants have 6, we don't know. There's all of these problems with it. Nevertheless, she's persevered and she's managed to do one section of an elephant, dwarf elephant tooth from Cypress, and her data set shows that yes, it did take less time to form than the same type of plate in a big elephant, but nowhere near as short a time as you would have predicted based on its size. So it hasn't slowed down its life history as much as you would predict based on its body size. But that's just one tiny data point. So I'm like, oh my God, I need more information. But we haven't got it.
Right. Victoria, thank you very much. Let us congratulate you for a wonderful lecture. let us adjourn to the lower library, taking great care of the bookcases. Thank you, that was absolutely terrific. Just wonderful.